Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. So today we're going to do another episode of the Memory Lane series, which is where we take a look back at some interesting articles and interviews from old Guitar World magazines. So my dad has been subscribed to Guitar World magazine for about 30 years now. He saved a bunch of old magazines. He was kind enough to let me borrow some. The one we're going to take a look at this time was released in July 2007. You can see Slash on the cover. The article we're going to talk about actually focuses on Slash. It was written by Richard Beinstock. He sat down with Slash and talked about Velvet Revolver. Now everyone tends to associate Slash with Guns N' Roses. However, for a short time he was also part of the supergroup Velvet Revolver, which had a pretty big following in its own right. So we're going to see what he has to say. Here we go. It says, there was a time not too long ago when, despite releasing a couple of Snake Pit records and popping up every so often for the odd guest spot, it seemed Slash would forever be linked to Guns N' Roses. That his every move would be viewed as a mere pit stop on that band's inevitable road to reunion. That changed with Velvet Revolver, which he formed with ex-Guns bassist Duff McKagan and drummer Matt Sorum 5 years ago, and who are currently one of the biggest, baddest, and most successful American rock acts going. That was far from the expected outcome. From the outset, popular opinion had it that Velvet Revolver, which also includes former Stone Temple Pilots singer Scott Weiland, himself no stranger to conflict and controversy, and guitarist Dave Kushner, would go down in flames. It was like there was this strange desire to see us fail, Slash said. There was so much undue pressure put on us because of who we are and the bands we came out of. People basically pigeonholed us as this chemically abusive group of guys, and it seemed like all anyone wanted to talk about were these tired stories and incidents from our past. Although the band garnered its fair share of tabloid-style turmoil early on, most notably for Weiland's public bouts with drug addiction and tangles with the law, in the end Velvet Revolver proved their detractors wrong. Their 2004 debut, Contraband, entered the Billboard charts in the top position, spawned 4 hit singles, nabbed a Grammy, and has since sold more than 2 million copies in the US alone. In addition, the band pulled off a hugely successful globe-spanning tour in support of the album, during which Synexby, they didn't break up. Now they're back with Libertad, an album that is arguably more enjoyable and undoubtedly more ambitious than its predecessor. Contraband was a tumultuous, menacing record, an agonistic response to the intense public scrutiny placed on the nascent band. The airing of a VH1 reality show documenting their first steps didn't exactly help matters in this regard, as well as the strife created by their singer's personal and legal troubles. Libertad, on the other hand, is stylistically diverse, musically deep, and at times almost jubilant. Slash contends that he and Velvet Revolver weren't looking to do anything particularly different this time out, but were simply in a better place, both individually and collectively, than when working on Contraband. One thing we were conscious of was that we wanted to create something better than anything any of us had done in the past. As a result, I think we came up with a record that's pretty dynamic. Also, we were more comfortable writing with one another this time. And certainly, after all the touring, more used to playing together. In every way, we're just a better band now. The evidence of this is all over Libertad, on which Velvet Revolver sounds positively reinvigorated. Full throttle cuts like Let It Roll, She Builds Quick Machines, and Just 16 tear by with an energy and exhilaration too often lacking in musicians more than half their age. The songs continue to be anchored by McKagan and Sorum's powerhouse rumble, and characterized by Slash's bluesy riffing and leads, but there's also a substantial sonic contribution from the other band members as well. Dave Kushner, for one, took on a larger role in the writing process this time, most notably on the funky Get Out the Door, for which he supplied much of the music. Dave was coming up with some cool stuff all over the place, Slash says, and he wrote some guitar lines that really offset what I was doing, which gave the songs a little more depth. Weiland, for his part, was always the band's primary lyricist, but had yet to join Velvet Revolver when much of the music for Contraband was conceived. This time, Slash says, Weiland had a lot more input on the songwriting. What's more, the rest of us were writing more consciously for Scott, whereas with some of the material that was on the last record, we were writing without having any specific voice in mind. Indeed, Weiland's more overt pop sensibilities, so pronounced on many of Stone Temple Pilots' biggest hits, seemed to have rubbed off on his current bandmates on Libertad, as evidenced by the slinky groove of She Mine and the soaring melody of This Fight. Overall, Slash says, the key to this album is that everyone's voice was heard. We all just wrote, both individually and together, and then went into a rehearsal space and worked through everything as a band. When it came time to record, it really felt like everyone had put their stamp on each song. That's not to say, however, that things were rose-tinted throughout the making of Libertad. This is, after all, Velvet Revolver. It's never that simple with us, Slash says with a laugh, and I can't really see a time when it will ever be. For starters, there was the Rick Rubin affair. The band initially tapped the renowned rock and hip-hop producer to man the boards for Libertad, but after almost 3 months of spinning their wheels, they let him go. Rick just wasn't offering the kind of hands-on interaction that we needed, Slash explains. We were ready to go, and he would just show up and say, write more songs, and then take off. He's a guy who has a lot going on. The new Metallica album, some other bands he's working with, and it sort of felt like he was double-dipping, you know. He wasn't around enough. Returning to Contraband producer Josh Abraham was also out of the question. Josh didn't have a very good understanding of the old-school way we do things. He was used to working with metal bands who used like Line 6 pods and to record their guitars. In the end, Velvet Revolver enlisted Brendan O'Brien, the producer behind all 5 Stone Temple Pilots studio albums. What's funny, Slash says, is that at first I was wary of Brendan because of his work with STP. I never really liked the STP guitar sound, but he and Scott obviously go way back. And it turned out that Brendan had a really good feel for what we're about. Plus, he's a great musician, so it was easy to communicate with him on a musical level. After spending much of the previous year writing and rehearsing the new material, Velvet Revolver finally began recording Libertad at Henson Recording Studios in Hollywood in early January 2007. The band worked on the album through much of the winter, cutting many of the basic tracks live. Slash says, we did a ton of pre-production before going in, and had been playing the songs together in a room for so long that we were able to just get the material down on tape that way. In the studio, Slash relied primarily on his 1959 Les Paul Standard replica, fitted with Seymour Duncan Alnico 2 Zebra pickups, that was built in the mid-'80s by Chris Derrick. I used that guitar on Appetite for Destruction, says Slash, in every album I've recorded since. Other instruments included a 1965 Fender Strat, which he played on the ballad Grave Dancer, and a Gretsch 6119 Tennessee Rose Hollow Body, the round clean tones of which can be heard on This Fight. Rhythm tracks and solos were recorded through a mid-'80s Marshall JCM 800 2203 and a 1988 Marshall JCM 2555. In 1996, this amplifier was reissued as the Slash signature model. Both amps were fed into Marshall 4x12 cabinets. Additionally, Slash employed various small combo amps, including a tiny old beat-up Vox AC-15 for color and tonal variation. Outboard gear used on solos included a Dunlop MXR gain/boost, a Chicago Iron Octavia, and a variety of Dunlop wahs, including his signature model and a rack-mounted custom shop unit. While his guitar and amplifier setup has been fairly consistent in recent years, Slash changed up his tone for Libertad. In particular, he reveals that he used less saturation than in the past, because I really wanted to hear the steel of the strings and the wood of the instrument. Over the last few years, I've been hearing some great guitar sounds, real punchy stuff that hasn't been quite so overdriven. It's cool sometimes to dial in tons of distortion, but doing that will also kind of phony up your tone. I've been getting into the idea of using a cleaner sound to get a more dynamic attack from the guitar. And from a performance standpoint, he says that Libertad features more of the live rhythm tracks than any record I've done. And there are also some scratch solos that made it to the final mix. My leads are usually only somewhat worked out in my head before I lay them down, but this time I was even more spontaneous. I'd come up with something on the spot, and the first or second take was what made it on the album. By the end of the sessions, Velvet Revolver had laid down music for nearly 20 songs. Weiland then cut his vocals at Henson, as well as at Southern Tracks Recording in Atlanta. It was around this time, however, that tragedy struck. While in the midst of tracking his vocals, the singer received word that his younger brother Michael had died of a drug overdose. It was just a terrible thing, Slash says. Scott was completely devastated, but he kept it together. Despite Weiland's history with substance abuse, the band never worried that he might relapse. You never know how someone's going to react when they're hit with that kind of news, but Scott's done as much as he can to keep himself straight. He's in a much better place now than he was a few years ago. I mean, when we were making the last record, he was living in a halfway house and looking at jail time. We knew he wasn't going to let himself go there, so we just let him know we were there for him. In an unfortunate turn of events, the members of Velvet Revolver soon found themselves lending their support to another bandmate when Matt Sorum took leave to attend to his own brother, who was in the final stages of a long battle with cancer. He passed away not long after the recording sessions for Libertad were completed. It was a tough period for those guys, Slash says. With this band, it seems like drugs and death and all that is all that gets written about and all anyone talks about. But then stuff like this happens and you realize how poignant and sad these situations really are. That said, the guitarist faced his own, albeit less severe, situation during the making of Libertad. Early on, while Velvet Revolver were still working through material in preparation for the studio, Slash took some time off and quietly checked into rehab. There were a lot of crazy things going on in my life, and it just got to a point where I needed to get away to get my head together, he explains. We hit some downtime from writing and rehearsing, and I decided to check in. As to what it was that specifically led to his decision, Slash will only say, it wasn't like a long, drawn-out type of drug thing. I hadn't been using all the time. I just went on a little binge and took it to the nines, knowing that on a certain date I was going to walk into rehab. He smiles, and after I got out, we went straight to work. And it's the work that's always been key for Slash. The guitarist admits that he finds it hard to deal with periods of inactivity. It's usually when things aren't moving a million miles a minute that I get myself in trouble, he says slyly, and as such, he shouldn't have any problem being a good boy for the foreseeable future. Libertad is being mastered as we speak, and tomorrow afternoon, Velvet Revolver begins rehearsals for their upcoming tour. First up is South America, where the band has booked a string of dates in Chile, Brazil, and Argentina. After that, it's back to the U.S. for a headlining club joint, and then over to the UK and Europe for a slew of festival appearances, after which they'll head back out on their own. Of course, controversy will always be lurking. Take for starters the band's bizarre part in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony in New York City this past March. After signing on to perform in tribute to the inductees Van Halen, most of whose members opted to not show up for the event, Velvet Revolver nixed an offer from estranged Van Halen frontman David Lee Roth to back him in a run-through of his former group's keyboard-heavy hit Jump. In the end, Slash and company phoned in 2 Van Halen covers, and Ross slagged them in the press. More recently, Scott Weiland was back in the news when he allegedly trashed a hotel room during a domestic dispute with his wife Mary, and a few days later when his wife was arrested for torching $10,000 worth of the singer's clothing outside their Los Angeles home. But Slash says, "It all just comes with the territory. I couldn't imagine being in a band where everything is just peachy all the time. That's not what rock and roll, at least to me, has ever been about. So yeah, in Velvet Revolver we have our issues," he laughs, "and we probably always will. The way the personalities in this band work, I just don't see that changing." Slash reaches for another cigarette and continues, "But the thing is, we take what we do pretty seriously. We've gone through a lot of... but we don't make light of any of it. There's a lot of life in this group. A lot of emotion and angst and anger and passion, and all that comes when we write together, when we record together, and when we play together." He lights the cigarette and takes a long drag. "So I really don't spend a lot of time worrying about what other people are thinking, or what they're going to say about things that are going on in my band. They can just keep talking about all the... We're just going to keep making music." So that takes us to the end of the article. It was pretty emotional reading that, hearing about all the emotional stuff, all the tragedy that struck Velvet Revolver. It made me feel pretty torn up. It was also bittersweet reading through that. We know now that Libertad was Velvet Revolver's last studio album before they split up. Of course, Scott Weiland went back to Stone Temple Pilots. Slash returned to Guns N' Roses. Everyone went their separate ways. So, it's sad we never got to see another album from them. So that does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.